bunch of different things. These modules are basically what we've decided to do between Brian, myself, and Bill, and a few of the other guys that we have helping us out, and gals, sorry, is we're trying to make it kind of a very casual thing. So instead of having it, we were originally going to do a checklist, but everybody's needs are different, so it makes more sense to do it with, you know, if we happen to be at an event like I'll be talking about in a moment, we'll be able to actually have people ask questions specifically, because some people may know how to do polar aligning, but they might be having trouble doing something else, and it varies with the individual. So currently we have three of our main mentors here, myself, Brian, and Bill, and of course Abdul's been helping out a lot. I'll talk about that in a few minutes, and then we have a few other guys that have mentioned that they can help out as well on occasion, so that's very much appreciated, guys. We had a binocular newbie night, actually at Birds Hill Park on 13th April, or a month ago, when we had just after our meeting, and it was a lot of fun. We had 24 members that came out. I would say 90% of them were fairly new members, and everybody had a really good time. Even though we had binoculars predominantly out, there were a few scopes out, and a few people got a chance to kind of do first light on their scopes and stuff, and then the week later we did a kind of a little mini version of that as well. It was a lot of fun. Bill did a fantastic sky tour for everybody. We have some photos of it, and it was really, really neat. We were actually over at Birds Hill Park, just off the North Drive. That's where the observing site was, because Glen Lee hadn't been available, or we weren't sure if it was going to be available, so that's why we used that one. This is sort of what it looks like. I think some of you may have gone here before, but it's a fairly open field, and it's easy access off the road. This is an example of us setting up before dark there. We had all the scopes and binos out. Everybody's kind of congregating, just kind of getting ready for things to get a little darker. And then, of course, getting some sky candy. Bill did his sky tour, and of course we had, in good fashion, we had myself and Brian act as spotters for aircraft, so we didn't inadvertently break any laws. And it was a lot of fun, so we're going to be doing more of those for our new members. So I wanted to just do a quick thanks for Bill, because he really did a lot of help, and so did Abdul. Thank you again, Abdul, for that. That was much appreciated. Coming out and really helping was a huge help. And of course, Brian, for some of the field photos and the member support as well. And of course, anybody who's here that attended, thank you again for coming out. We had a lot of fun, and we're going to, like I said, do more of these over the year. I wanted to mention something as well really quickly. Yash Peterson, I don't know if he's here tonight, but I'd like to congratulate him. He actually got an internship over the summer, and he's going to be studying at the Haus der Astronomie near Heidelberg, Germany, in late July and early August. It's for high school students internationally. I did send an article in for the July-August edition of our newsletter on this, but I thought I'd just mention it really quickly, because it's always nice when we hear good news for some of our new members. So he's going to be going, and with his family, he's going to be staying with some relatives out there, and he's going to be studying under a gentleman by the name of Dr. Marcus Plossel, and they're going to be looking at a lot of different data sets and coming up with their own projects, and it should be really interesting. I've already talked to him about doing a talk maybe later on once they get the results of some of their projects. I think it'll be really interesting. So, Yash, are you here tonight? I didn't see him here, so, okay. Well, I guess we can just clap anyway, I guess. Congratulations. Nice to see a young man get a good start in the astrophysics. All right, so I'll just get on to my talk now. I wanted to do that first. Give me a second here. Thanks for your patience here on this. I think I got it here. Here we go. Is it up? No, it's not up. Sort of close the message. Is she up now? It will be, I think. There's a presentation right here. Oh, there we go. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, again, we're going to do part 2 here. I actually changed the part 2 a little bit. It's going to be a little lighter today. There's so much information to go through, and we start getting into sensors and cameras and then workflow. That's almost a talk unto itself. I mean, like more advanced sensor and noise reduction talk. So I'm going to keep it very kind of light tonight. We're basically going to talk about equipment, accessories, options, and enhancements for cameras. So basically we're going to just do a quick review on what we did last week, and then, is that you, Yasha? Well, you missed your, well, let's congratulate him again. You missed your big moment. I was talking about your internship, so feel free to ask him about it at the break. Anyway, tracking mounts and options, more on lenses and adapters, and adapting to telescope, of course. Some essential accessories if you want to do longer exposure, and some modifications that can be done for DSLRs as well. So just a reminder, first of all, the DSLR types that we're normally looking at are these two, full frame and APS-C, to remind everybody from last week. There may be a few of you that didn't attend last week's talk, but those are the sensors that we're normally using. And just a reminder as well to calculate, we're using normally these types of sensors here for most of the DSLRs for shooting, and in that case, you've got 3:2 ratio, and you can calculate the angular field of view by using F is the focal length of your lens or telescope, and then S is the sensor dimension in millimeters as well, and then that gives you your angular. So you can use that formula for calculating the field of view when you're getting ready to do more telephoto type shooting. And again, just another reminder here, using fixed lenses if you're doing skyscape photography where you're not tracking. We're going to be talking about tracking tonight a little bit. And in this case, you're going to be limited to, in most cases, depending on the focal length of the lens, 10 seconds or maybe slightly longer, but certainly no more than 30 seconds before you start getting star trails. Again, when I talked last week, last month, we talked about, if you want star trails, it's not a problem. You can continue to extend your exposure, but if you're trying to get relatively pin crisp stars, you definitely have to stay within that. So again, this just is a reminder on this frame that I did last time. These are some exposure times where you're not getting star trailing, and again, the difference between the focal lengths of the lenses have to do with the size of the sensor. So just a little refresher there. And I'll just move this up for a second or so. So you can see at 15 seconds we're okay, but once we get beyond 30, we're starting to see significant trailing. So again, if you're trying to achieve that effect, no problem. Now once we get into larger ones, this is what we're kind of talking about tonight, although it's not restricted to necessarily using medium telephoto equipment or even full telephoto lenses. You can still do this with the wide field as well and extend your exposures. First thing you obviously need is a tripod. This is some examples of some that would be relatively adequate. I didn't bother getting the pricing because it does vary depending on the vendor. I do have some price ranges in a moment here. Typically, you're probably going to expect to pay for a decent photo tripod, somewhere between $130 and $250 minimum for a really good tripod. You should try and target something in the range of 1.5 or 1.8 times to 2.5 times or higher as far as the load capability. So if, let's say, your camera lens weighs 1.5 pounds or something like that, 700 grams or maybe even a kilogram, you want to have a minimum of 2,500 gram loading, because otherwise it's going to be shaking in the wind and you're going to have other challenges. The other idea too is if you did want to use it with binoculars or some other, maybe a lightweight scope, you could get a heavier duty tripod, and then that helps you out a lot too. So different mounts you can do are obviously ball mounts work really well for just being able to do general panning if you're doing your fixed shooting. And of course some tilt pan heads work very well, but you have to be mindful of the fact that in the weather that we typically have here in Manitoba, as you get to freezing and below, those pan heads can get pretty tight if they're fluid filled, so just be mindful of that. There are some that just come with Teflon pads, so you'll have to ask the questions as to what the operation of the market. There's just too many to cover. Some good choices are Bogan and Manfrotto. They're more of the professional grade of equipment for tripods, and then of course there's some other higher end like BizTech slick tripods, and there's some other ones too. You could also use even a wooden tripod. There's I know Overwork offers one. There's Burlbach has another one. Those are a little heavier, but they would certainly work for doing shooting, or if you wanted to put on one of the mounts I'm going to be talking about in a few minutes. So now we'll talk about long exposure photography tonight a little bit more. So this is when you're going beyond those limits that we had in the when you're doing still, where you're not wanting to get star trails, but you need to dig deeper than what you're getting with a short exposure. These are some examples of 3 mounts that are very common, in fact the Fornax one is a fairly little newer one, but this has gotten some good reviews. It's a little bit more expensive, but it's very accurate on tracking, and you can do some custom tracking with it as well. We have the Skywatcher here, this one. We have one that you can, if you want to get into doing some experimenting with longer exposure photography, just talk to Abdul and we can get it signed out for you. You can have it for a month and play around. That's a lot of time. I think they're going to probably have the PST on the mount tomorrow, right, Brendan? Yeah. For Astronomy Day there, yeah. So then if you want to take a look at it, or if you're curious after the event, you might want to sign it out and then stick your DSLR on it. That would be a good way to go. It's really a nice little mount. And it has its pluses and minuses, all of them do, but you know, generally it'll get you going anyway. Certainly if you don't want to have to use a big German equatorial mount, this is a good way to go. And the Vixen Polary, I've got one of these. I think we have a few other members as well. It's like Sheila, I think she has one as well. And they're quite a nice little mount. A little bit more expensive, but very lightweight and portable. So again, you know, which one would you choose? It really depends on what your preferences are and what you're looking at loading it up with. The nice thing with the Skywatcher is, well, in fact, you can get some accessories for the Polary as well, but you can have the ability to put on counterweights and put on a small telescope on top. So if you had, say, a little 70mm short tube refractor and you wanted to use that as your telephoto lens, it would be very easy to do. These are some typical pricings for some of these mount systems. You can get them for a little less depending on the accessory kits that you're getting, but typically you can expect to pay between $500 and $1,200 plus for Polary, $450 to $600 for a Skywatcher. There's actually a sale right now on Ontario telescopes. I don't know if some of you saw the notes on our email reflector, but I think it's just below $500 if I'm not mistaken. It's about $90 off, and that's a pretty good price for that this type of system. And then there's other mounts. Ioptron makes one. I mentioned Fornax before, and again, you started getting into the $1,100 plus range for some of these, depending on what kind of accessories you're looking at getting. You can also get heavy load kits for a lot of them as well. So if you are planning down the road of adding a telescope, you may want to start just using your camera now, but if you have the option to add on counterweights and so on, it makes it really nice because you've got, you know, flexibility. I mentioned this already here about being on loan for. All right, so if you, let's say, want to go to the next level, you want to take your DSLR now and attach it to the telescope. Depending on the scope that you're going to use, it may be too heavy for one of these lighter weight mounts that I was talking about. So then we're looking at either a guided one for longer exposure, or you could do what's called an unguided setup as well. And you can see here basically what you're doing is just sticking the camera into the telescope tube, and you're using it as your telephoto lens, and then you're using the gem to do the tracking. Okay, so really slick. When you're looking at guided, though, it's a little bit more complex because usually you're going to use either a guide scope or an off-axis guider. I'll talk about those in a moment, just generically. And the idea here is this guide camera will basically either go to a computer, or some guide cameras will interface into the mount and allow the system to track and correct for error issues and so on, drift issues. This is an example of what you're going to see sometimes. There's always, with mechanical issues on a lot of these mounts, you're always going to get somewhat they call periodic error. It has to do with, and this would be the error that you see. You'll see it if you're looking at a drift of a star. If you were not trying to correct for this, they call it periodic error because just like a sine wave, you have a fixed period here, and you'll see the stars, you know, drift and then come back, and then drift and then come back. And that's due to mechanical issues most of the time. Auto guiding can offset some of those effects, as well as if you have bad polar alignment or not as ideal polar alignment, you are going to get drift and declination over time, so it will do some adjustments to try and offset that. And then, of course, the idea here is to use a guide star for it. So this is the basic setup here. Basically, you'll either have a guide scope or off-axis. In this case, we're talking about the guide scope. You might have a telescope, and you're going to have your DSLR on here, an intervalometer. I'll talk about that in a little bit too. And then you'll have your auto-guiding camera. If you're using an auto-guiding camera that requires a computer, it's going to be attached to this, and then it's going to send commands via the software to adjust your mount. Okay, really simple setup, but it does involve it adds a lot more complexity than just doing visual observing for sure. And you'll have to be mindful of the fact that if you've got a lot of cables, you want to keep things fairly clean, or you'll be accidentally hooking on things, or if your cables are too heavy, they might start to get really stiff in the cold, so you have to be mindful of that as well when you're doing it. Is Sheila here tonight? I didn't see her. Okay. I was going to ask her a question, but maybe next time she's in. We talked about an off-axis guider, and this is basically an alternative to using a guide scope. Basically what happens here is you have a little small prism here. It's usually a prism, but some will use a mirror diagonal, but usually it's a prism. And it just samples part of the light cone coming off the telescope and directs it upwards. So you have your guide camera on here, and then you'd have your main telescope here, and then whatever sort of accessory that you wanted to have, like your DSLR or CCD or whatever you're using. So the idea is the light comes through and splits, your main camera's here, and then your secondary camera's there. So this way you get to image and guide using one instrument instead of two. There are some advantages to that. One of the disadvantages is because this is a very small prism, it's going to sample a very small area of the sky, so you have to make sure that you have a decent guide star in the field of view there. It can present some challenges sometimes. So this is sort of what the layout would look like here. Okay, so you can see it's pretty straightforward, but very, very effective. Okay, so this is where you can get, and depending on how good your mount is, and as well as how well you polar align, you can do very long exposures, like in 10-15 minute range ideally. Most people don't do much more beyond 6 to 10, but you could go even longer if you had to. Excuse me. Now there are also dedicated auto guiding cameras instead of using like a star shoot or something like that. You basically, what these do is they have a little screen on the back. Celestron makes one here, and it has a little hand controller, so you can do micro adjustments to get a guide star in the screen, and it'll lock on, and then the signals go directly to the mount. And the nice thing about that is it simplifies your setup, because now you don't have a computer running the camera. It's actually all computerized inside, and then it allows you to have your DSLR on the scope. You could still use this with an off-axis guider, but it usually works better with a guide scope. And again, this is a very effective way of doing it. It also minimizes your wire load, I guess, on the whole setup, and makes it much more simple to use. Has anybody used these?
I had one, but I couldn't get it working, so I gave it away. It's a Saskatchewan summer star party.
Okay. What was it, just having trouble locking, or what was the deal?
Couldn't find a star.
Oh, okay, yeah. I think you're kind of, if I remember in the document, I've got one too. I haven't had a chance to play with it as much as I'd like to yet, but my understanding is that I think you need an 8th magnitude star or brighter in order for it to really lock on properly. So if you're in an area that's very bereft of stars, it can be a bit of a challenge. And I think also the size of the guide scope will help too a little bit. But they can be effective. I know guys who use these and they love them, and there's other people like yourself that's had trouble, so I don't know. But it is an option, so if you're thinking of going this route, obviously ask the questions and get kind of a consensus before you do it. Well, last month I talked about manual focus lenses, like old glass for, let's say, full frame cameras and so on, and how you can get some pretty decent deals on very nice high quality lenses for a lot less money than you would normally pay, let's say, for a premium Canon lens and so on, and they actually do very, very well. I'm not going to get into this too heavy tonight, but here's 2 examples here. This is what I would call new glass. There's some new Chinese companies, like 7 Artisans is one of them. They make this, they make a couple of different ones. I bought in the late fall, early winter, just before Christmas, a bunch of these. I've got like a 50 millimeter it's 50 millimeter f1.1 or something ridiculous. And this one here is a 35 millimeter f1.2. And both of those I've played with a little bit, just generally shooting indoors, and they seem pretty good, but I haven't had a chance to take them out under the stars yet. They're very inexpensive. Some of them will run less than $130 Canadian. And a lot of them have mating flanges to actually directly mount to, let's say, an EOS M camera, or if you have a 60D or something like that. I don't think they will work very well with full frame cameras though, but they will work well with those other ones. These ones here though are designed for full frame as well as for, let's say, a APS-C type of thing, because they're 35 millimeter lenses. And basically, like this one here is an 85 millimeter 1.8 to 1, very fast lens. Some of these are very, very high quality, and in fact, I think Damon, you had mentioned the what was it, Rokinon or something? Yeah, there's a bunch of really good ones that are out there. My advice is, if you're thinking of going this route, ask a few people who have used them. I've got some older Canon ones, just like with the Chinese class, I really haven't had a chance to play with them too much until recently, but I've been busy doing visual astronomy, and I haven't really had a chance to do a lot of sky shooting. I'm hoping to do that a little later on this summer and into the early fall. But they should work very well, and the Rokinon, from what I understand, is a pretty good lens too, eh? So there's a wide range of manufacturers. There's older Olympus camera lenses that were made in Japan, and they were the top of the line and were, well, considered pretty good semi-professional kit in the day. And even though the coatings are a little different, most of them are still very well figured and excellent lenses. So they're definitely worth a look, because you can get them for cents on the dollar compared to buying a brand new, let's say, Nikon lens or something like that. And because we're shooting manual, as a reminder, you don't need to have all that electronic junk going on, because you're at infinity focus and you're manually setting your aperture, so it's really, really easy to do. So the idea here basically is to take the lens, and then you buy a lens adapter here, and just adapt it to the camera. You do have to use a little bit of care on this though, because when you're doing there are some different flange mounting systems depending on the type of camera you have. Like there's EOS R now, and EOS M is the same as the standard APS-C lens sets. And then of course a Nikon has its own. There's Olympus cameras and so on. So depending on the type of DSLR you're looking at getting, or that you already have, you'll have to double check the mounting flange. And this lens, it could be a different lens mount, but it's okay, because you can almost get an adapter for just about any lens you want, almost. So just make sure that you check. There's a lot more opportunity to get into this kind of thing with your crop sensors, because you can use, like I say, the full frame and some of these specialty lenses, as well as make sure that the lens is compatible with the DSLR. There may be some that might vignette, like as an example, a full frame EOS camera, some lenses may not give you the full illuminated sensor. Make sure also in infinity focus. This is very important when you're using these lenses that aren't necessarily designed for that specific camera. Some of them, depending on the type of adapter you use, may not necessarily achieve infinity focus. I'll give you an example. The OM lenses, as an example, the Olympus ones, you can get adapters that are designed for like general sort of more portrait type photography, and they don't have there's a little condenser lens in the adapter that's used for doing infinity shots. But if you're doing just like close-up portraiture, like to you as an example, you don't necessarily need that. So you can get an adapter that doesn't have that lens in it. There are some advantages to that, because you have one less piece of glass for one thing. And it also, I think, allows you to get a little closer focus on it. So there are some things there. If you're not sure, just ask. I mean, I'm still learning a little bit myself, but we do have a number of members that have played around with this, so it's worth looking into. The other thing to be mindful of is as we get into more mirrorless cameras, and even when you're looking at adapting a camera to a telescope, be mindful of the flange distance here. And this is some example for some Canon lenses. The standard SLRs, like the 6D and so on, have a 40 millimeter flange distance to the sensor, whereas the EOS M and EOS R are almost, well, they're within that 18 to 20 range, about half. And that will be important when you're trying to achieve focus, because if you're going to shoot through a Newtonian as an example, you may only have a limited amount of back focus to work with. So you're going to have to try and make sure that you can achieve that with your camera, otherwise you'll never be able to get a proper focus. Quite often what will happen, besides, I'll be talking about some accessories right away here, there's like T adapters and so on that you use. And again, if we're going to adapt the telescope to a camera, this is an example of a T adapter. So you have what's called a T-ring, leads to the front flange, and then there's a series of threads, and then depending on the type of focuser that you have, you'll either use 1.25" or 2 inch, or it depends on how you're doing it, but you can basically use this in lieu of your diagonal or eyepiece. So basically for prime focus, the light comes through the telescope and hits the sensor directly. Where this flange distance becomes a problem is you may have, it might be too close, you may not be able to get enough back focus. You can actually get an extension tube as well on there. Some of them are threaded, and some of them you would just get an extension tube like you would for, say, an eyepiece. And you could even take an old Barlow and unthread the sellout and then that would make your extension tube for you as well. So again, you'll have to evaluate that depending on the type of instrument you're using as to what kind of spacing you're going to need. Now some of the other things that, some of the other accessories that are very handy, this one here is called an intervalometer. I mentioned it just briefly before. The intervalometer is basically a way for you to be able to do manually controlled shooting and get extended exposures where you're beyond, let's say, the 30-second range on like most DSLRs. I think the Nikons go to 1 minute, but most of the Canon ones will go to 30 seconds. So you'll notice that a lot of the DSLRs on a bulb setting. That basically means that if you had, in the old days, they would use a pneumatic bulb, I guess, to hold down the shutter. Nowadays, you would hold the shutter button down, and as soon as you release, then it stops. So it's basically a manually controlled. These accessories interface into the camera. Some of them are wireless and can run off of Bluetooth, or there's even apps in some cases where you get an adapter that fits into your on some of the newer DSLRs, and then you can run it from your iPhone and stuff. But they do the same function. Basically, the idea is you can set them up to do multiple shots and extended exposures, pretty much up to, I think, 99 minutes or something. Some of them will go even longer than that. And then you can have a spacing between time and then continue on. So once you set them up and you've got everything going, you can just walk away, chit-chat with your friends, or eat a bag of chips, or whatever you wanted to do, and you've got a whole bunch of shots, and then you can look at them later and stack them and process them. So very handy to have. Well, I'll finish off tonight talking about spectrally enhanced DSLRs, and this is something that I know some of our more advanced members are probably a little bit more familiar with, but for you new folks or folks that haven't thought of doing this before, one of the challenges that we do have with the DSLR is that they're usually designed to do faithful reproduction of the image to emulate what our eyes see, right? The standard white balance. Problem is, though, when we look at the spectral curve here, this yellow one, this is for a Nikon camera, and you can see here how it has a roll-off in the red, okay, and this is to avoid the infrared kind of starting to, the signal gets more, the sensor gets more sensitive as you get infrared through it. So the idea here is to give you a nice white balance, and this coupled with the sensor response gives you an approximation to what we would see with our eye. Problem is, though, if I'm shooting, let's say, something like, let's say the horse head or something like that, where there's a fair amount of hydrogen alpha, we're only getting about 20, in this case 22, 23%, and that's a problem, because now I'm going to have to expose that much longer if I want that region to show up. So the idea here is to replace that particular filter either in front of the sensor or have that thing totally removed and use a, there are a variety of them, some clipped in and so on. This allows you now to have an extended red range. Now you can imagine 90 versus 23, I can shoot 3 times shorter exposure and still have the same amount of relative photons hitting the sensor for that particular thing. Also, if you were using, let's say, a hydrogen alpha filter in the nose piece of the camera adapter, now you've got, again, the advantage of being able to do a shorter exposure. So this is an example spectrally of what you kind of see. If you were to, like the upper one here is just an unmodified camera, you can see the H-alpha just almost doesn't pass. Like this is sort of where it starts to get cut off. Even an IR cut filter here might do the same thing, but you'd have a big extended exposure in the violet or violet blue. And again, this one here would be now a UV IR cut filter with an anti-alias one. You can see you get a little bit more brightness here. So as we start to pass through more H-alpha, this helps. This is the only region of the spectrum we have to really worry about, because the peak response for the camera filters and the sensors tends to be in this range anyway for most of them. Even though the red sensor will have some sensitivity in here, the problem is that main filter in front is cutting it off. And then, of course, full spectrum modification, there are reasons to do that. One would be if you wanted to start doing spectroscopy and you wanted some of the bands in the near infrared, or if you wanted to shoot planets, let's say, and use a methane filter. Some telescopes, like certain refractors, will actually do very well, or even Maksudovs, Richard Critchens. They can actually, some of them are designed to actually work fairly well in the even down to a micron or 1,000 nanometers. And again, in order to be able to get that, you either have to have a totally spectrally unlocked camera. It's more common with a CCD type camera, but DSLRs don't normally have that luxury stock, so you'd have to modify them. But again, for doing some of this kind of thing, you can definitely have some options. Well, that's, now what ends up happening here, you can see here, again, I talked about doing 3 times exposure. So after the mod, you can see, it might be hard to see it out of the back there, but you almost can't see anything on this eastern veil here, whereas you can see a little bit more here after putting in a different filter. Okay, so the nebulosity is canceled off. Here's a better example. It's a little brighter image. Sorry about the exposure on the other one, but this would be an example of stock modified versus modified. And again, you're going to get a lot more red response, so there are reasons for wanting to do that. You're like, can you shoot hydrogen regions and galaxies, H2 regions, and so on? A great way to do this. And again, you can do the longer exposures, but then you run the risk of kind of reaching the limit of the mount. You can run into tracking error issues later on if you go too long. Well, that's basically in a nutshell tonight. Like I said, I just wanted to keep it a little lighter tonight. Appreciate your time. Does anybody have any questions before I step off the podium? You gentlemen. Yes?
Where is Abdul?
Pardon?
Where is Abdul?
Where's Abdul? Right there.
Oh, there you are.
Yeah. That was an easy one.
That was an easy question.
I like that one. Thanks. Keep coming like that. Well, thank you very much, guys. Like I said, it was a little late tonight. Sorry about that. In the early fall, I'll be following up with a lot more on cameras and so on as a follow-up to this. Next month, I'm going to be doing solar observing, and I think that'll be a good one for everybody because we're getting into summer now. A lot of people want to see the sun. Who's next? You are. Yeah, don't hide. You can't get away. Oh, sorry, one last thing I just wanted to mention, sorry. For those folks that are interested, for some of our newer members that haven't used any of our sign-out jobs, Abdul, myself, and Karen are going to do a little sort of a demo on the jobs. So I know it would be nice to be out under the sky, but unfortunately it's still going to be too light this time of year. But I know some people might be a little worried about signing one out because they don't know how to use it. So we'll just kind of cover it briefly for you guys. So if anybody's interested, let us know.
Hey, Derek. Did you want to mention these? Did you want to mention them? Sorry. Did you want to mention these?
No, I'll do it afterwards. We'll do it after the
Okay.
All right, thanks everyone for coming. We got quite a lineup for today, as you can see. We have a special announcement from Sylvia about the Star Party. It'll be after the intro. And we have a very special... I was seeing something. All right. Dr. Philip Burgess, University of Manitoba. I read his work on it earlier. It's quite in-depth in terms of the history of the Canadian space program. So we'll get a little bit of history and the influence of the Canadian space program. And of course we have What's Up with Jay, What's New with Michelle, and we have the refreshments after that. I'll explain this later. This is kind of interesting. This is supposed to be a cat. Sylvia sent me the photo, so it was nice of her. Looks like a cat, so I'm trying to incorporate more cat photos. Anyways. All right, moving on. Okay, I got an update at the University of Manitoba Open House. It's still on May the 29th at 7 p.m. So it's still going on. And of course, there might be some observing, if they're permitting. They have a 16-inch beams up there. So I advise if anyone wants to come, please do. Stellar diversity is the topic, so that'll be interesting. What else we have? Astronomy Day, that's tomorrow. So if any volunteers want to come along, please do. It is from 11 to 4 p.m. It is the one on Kennison and McGilvery, the bookstore there, in Diagonal Bookstore. Okay, so if you want to come, please do. Solar scopes are needed, or if you want to, you can always man the desk that we have there. We have a little table there. You can hand out brochures and talk to the people there. I like it. I find it quite relaxing, but I have another event to go to on the same day, which is, oh, this is something else. Okay, the RASC meeting. Because I'm president now, I get to change this. Because of the Bomber game on July the 12th, I'm going to change it to June the 14th. And we'll start at the regular time. So unfortunately, we're going to change it up. The barbecue is going to be on the 12th of July. It's potluck. We are looking for barbecues, so if you want to come along, if he has the barbecues, please bring them. We are going to need them. Remember, it's only for members only. And of course, the location, typically, would be Glen Lee, but we're going to have a backup site if it does rain on that day. All right, Science Rendezvous. This is the event I'm going to, along with Jay and maybe a few other members. I just got a notice from Danielle. It starts at 11. This is in front of the engineering building, if you know where that is. We don't, but we'll be set up there. It starts from 11 to 4. Usually we end around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, usually. But volunteers are welcome. They can come at any time throughout the whole day. She'll be setting up around 9:30 a.m. And if you want volunteers, if you want to have any questions about it, please contact her at her cell number. So that's tomorrow. That's where I'm going to be. Spruce Wood Start Party. As I mentioned, Sylvia has got an update on it right after this intro. So if you have any questions, she'll have a better detail about what's going on, and I think I gave her some photos and show you what it's all about. And yes, you will need a park pass. Telescope loan programs. I think I'm moving a little too fast here. Abdul is sponsoring the telescope loaning program. I think we have one here. But that's for tomorrow, I believe. I don't know who's taking that. I'll find out soon enough. So, if you're a new member, you're not quite sure about which telescope to get, you want to try it out, please do come see Abdul. And we'll mention some of the programs or some of the telescopes that we have. This is just an example of what we have to offer to the new members. We do have new telescopes, which I have to integrate into this program, which I have to review first. But yeah, if you're unsure about which telescope to go into, you can always lend them. It's free, and it's open to anyone who is a member, of course. Glenlee observing. Well, what can I say about that? Well, I guess I think next weekend we're going to be putting Glenlee back together again, not this weekend. I think it'll be next weekend. I believe, Jay? When is it? Are you here? Maybe he's not.
Yeah, he was.
He was.
What is it you want to know?
When are we going to put the equipment back into Glenlee? It's not this weekend, right? It's next weekend?
Sorry, Ed's talking to me.
Okay.
Glenlee's fine. The roads are open.
When are you going to get it going?
I'm not going to get it going.
Okay, anyways, we'll keep you posted on our RC list about when Glenlee's going to be finally up and running.
It's running.
I am the director of Glenlee, and Jay's been helping out with a few other members of preparing for the flood. We do have a training program for how to use the dome, how to use the LX200. If you want a warm room key, please come see me. I'll give you one. Okay, what else? And just kind of give an example of what the observatory is like. Through Brian, the other Brian, not me, the other Brian, who's been modifying Glenlee to be almost fully remote controllable from, well, actually fully remote controllable from the warm room. A lot of people have been donating coffee makers and microwave ovens and all that, so it's a fully functional. We do have a computer there, so I should have a picture of that. Of course, right now it's not fully functional because of flooding, so we'll have that back up running too, but we'll keep you posted on it. What else do I have? Okay, member site, looking at the weather tomorrow, and of course, Glenlee is not functioning, so we're going to have any member site tomorrow night. unfortunately. But we'll have other members night happening, I think maybe September long weekend. We're thinking of planning something at Glen Lee. Maybe Saturday or Sunday. Darren was thinking Friday. But we'll keep you posted. I'll have my final decision on Monday when we're going to have it. I was thinking it more like Sunday, you know, but we'll figure out for next weekend. Sporting Universe. Dennis is in charge of this. It's a great way to learn a little bit more about all the deep sky imaging or objects that we have out there. Sketching is a great way to familiarize with the different objects that we have there, like M31, Andromeda Galaxy, the dumbbell, and M3 or M1, all those different things. It's a great way. I used to do this at the beginning of it. I love sketching. It was a great way to relax at the end of the evening with my 8-inch dog. There's different ways of sketching. I think a lot of people will use, some people will use that dark paper with a white pencil, something like that. I think Sylvia, you're into that. So that's a kind of great way because it'll represent exactly how you see it, which I really like. All right, so if you want to see Dennis, Dennis, are you here? Probably not. Okay. All right. What else do I have? Okay, the mentor program, as Darren has mentioned, you know, come see us. We'll be here during the break. I think, Darren, you have that telescope set up?
Yeah, we're going to have the
Dog. Okay, so if you have any questions, please see him or me, but we'll be demonstrating some of the dog, how to use it. So if you have any questions about the mentor program, this is some of the programs that we have outlined for the new members. It's quite extensive. And it varies on dates and times. We'll let you know when we're going to have it. So if you're a little new to the program or astronomy, you know, we're here to help you. All right? And this is it, the council members. This is what we have for council members. Usually we try to stand up at the end of the month or at the end of the intro or before the break, actually. If you want to come see us, if you have any questions, the warm room key, or anything else, please come see us during the break. We're happy to help you out. Next, we'll follow Sylvia's little update on the Star Party. Sylvia? Is it? Yeah. Where is that? Where is it? I think you need this, right?
Yes. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay, let's test this. Okay, good. Okay, my name is Sylvia, and I am the Star Party planner. Is there anyone here that has never been to a Star Party before? Okay, so a few people. So I just put this together for that reason, for people who have never been, and see if maybe I can convince you to show up at this year's Star Party, which is happening on August 30th to September 2nd. So it's 3 nights at Spruce Woods Provincial Park. So what is a Star Party? Is where astronomers get together. It's the perfect place for amateur astronomers, professionals, people who have no experience to get together under the sky, because you can compare all the different kinds of equipment that you have. There's so many different things out there, and it's nice to compare notes, to ask questions, to see what everybody else is using, something new that you might want to check out. We share a dark sky together, so one of the main reasons is to get away from light pollution, because in the city there's a lot of light. In Spruce Woods we have pristine dark skies where we can enjoy the stars and see objects naked eye, just because there's just no light pollution interfering. These are actually members of the RASC set up at the Spruce Woods Star Party with their equipment. And actually those pictures were taken by, a lot of them were taken by Ron Berard. And this one is taken by Sheila, and it's a collage of what she observed during the Star Party. We had a little bit of aurora, she did a star trail, And there's pictures of tents because you can actually camp right in the observing field. The observing field doesn't have any trees or anything that can block your view. So make sure that if you come to the star party, you want to set up during the day and think about what's in your way. You don't want to camp beside a tree. It's nice during the day to have a tree, but at night it's just going to get in your way and you can't see the stars, right? It's an overnight excursion. So you can take a tent, you can take a camper if you like. Some people stay in yurts if you were lucky enough to book one this year. Others can rent a campsite. Now the best way to experience this though is to stay in the field with the astronomers. The big open field, we have lines where people can park their vehicle, their tent or their camper, and your telescope, or even if you don't bring a telescope, this is where you can stay the whole night and observe the night sky. Now because it's an overnight, even if it's during the summer, it's amazing how cold you will get at night. Plus sometimes it gets a little bit humid too, so you want to make sure you actually wear winter clothes. That's what I do. I even take a toque to make sure, because you know, if it gets humid and your head gets cold, you don't want to be out there no more, so you don't want that to happen. Go outside already prepared. Dress in layers, of course, before you get cold. Put on winter boots. Your feet will get so cold because observing at night doesn't take any energy. All you're doing is just standing there, and it's amazing how cold you'll get so fast. Bring lots of blankets. I froze the first 2 or 3 years of the star party. I always thought I had enough, but no, you need lots. Bring a good pillow. That's another thing I had to learn, because when you're looking at the sky all night, you actually get a sore neck. So you want to make sure that in the afternoon, when you take a nap from all you're observing during the night, you have a good pillow to support your neck. Bring a flashlight with a red cover. You can bring a white light for emergencies, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. Bring a book in case you can't. You know, sometimes there could be clouds, or maybe you just want to get away. Bring a book to pass the time. And you're responsible for your own food and water as well. Except for the night of the banquet. We actually hold a banquet with a full course meal, and it's included in the package. But for the rest of it, bring snacks, bring water so that you have all that with you. Set up during the day. It's so important because you don't want to come in at night and you don't know where your stuff is. Plus, it's a field full of people and really expensive equipment. So you don't want to drive in the middle of the night, blinding everyone as well. This is actually Jay's setup. He takes a long room. He needs to get there early in the morning, I think. And see, and you set up, then all you can do is just wait for the stars to appear. Like Sean Caesar here looks so happy. He's already set up his telescope for the night. So what type of equipment do people bring? You can bring anything you like. You can actually bring nothing if you don't want to. And if you don't have experience with the night sky, you might not want to bring a new telescope to a star party. I did that too. And basically you'll just be frustrated trying to figure it out. And if you don't, you're going to have to know where things are in the sky if you're going to bring a telescope so that you can guide it properly, etc. So the good thing and the satisfying thing to do if you're not bringing anything is bring a list of the items that you like to look at. There are so many books out there with ideas. Once you read them, you'll be like, I want to check out this cluster, which is located in this area, or I want to look at this planet. Once you have a list, all you have to do is bring your most comfortable lounger, maybe some binoculars if you want to, a nice blanket, and just check it all out. Go through your list. You'll be so happy that you did that. I usually take binoculars to the star party. They're so easy to deal with, and they can show you so many things in the night sky. And actually, even if you just have naked eye vision, you can see so many objects that you wouldn't see from the city. You can see clusters, constellations. You can even see a galaxy without any aid, like a binoculars. You can bring a telescope, so people bring all kinds of telescopes. Some big telescopes. Is Paul here tonight? I haven't seen him since the star party, I think. Some telescopes you have to climb a ladder to look at. So how do you get to Spruce Woods? It's really easy. It's a 2-hour drive down You can take highway number 2 or highway 1. I usually take number 2 because it's really pretty and more scenic. And you just drive until you hit number 5. And once you turn down highway number 5, you just follow the signs into the park. So why Spruce Woods Park? It's dark. It has one of the most pristine dark skies in the province of Manitoba. This is actually the hospitality tent that you see there, and you can tell everything is illuminated in red and dim colors so that we don't affect the night sky. And what can you do during the day? You can do solar observing. So you can do more astronomy, even during the daytime. A lot of people will bring telescopes. I'll bring my telescope and you can come and check out the sun during the day as well. Some people just park their campers and they're just very happy to sit around and wait for the night to come again. You're surrounded by a beautiful park and river. Chris, pay attention. You're on the screen. You can also go canoeing or paddleboarding like here. You can rent canoes from the park itself. The park has lots of amenities too, so if you wanted to buy food or anything like that, ice cream, they have all that right in the Spruce Woods Park. This is the Assiniboine River, by the way. You can go horseback riding just down the road. And the trails here are so unique. There are so many different kinds. There's spruce forest. There's a place that looks like a desert with desert dunes in it. There's a beach, so you can go swimming too. Bike trails everywhere. There's wildlife, but they're pretty friendly most of the time. And so there's 3 nights that this event goes on. The first night is the Friday, and we have nothing planned. We usually leave one night open for people to do whatever they want. Do observing, go for hikes, walks. On Saturday afternoon is when the planned events begin, and it's with the telescope tour. So basically, members of the club set up their telescopes all throughout the field, and somebody will guide us through all of these setups. And people will show us what their equipment does. This is Andrea showing us her Dobsonian 8-inch telescope. And here we have an astrophotography setup. Davidian, he built his own telescope, so he's telling us about how he went about that and how it works. There's Sheila showing some of her equipment. And following the telescope tour, we have a swap table. So remember everybody, if you have redundant eyepieces out there or you have too many telescopes, binoculars, bring them to the swap table. You can sell them, give them away, or you can trade them. So make sure you have some money in your pocket, you can make a deal on the spot. You have to be fast. And you have to be on time. Some people are like, it started already? Well, it's 2 minutes after it started. It's gone. So here's the Star Party field. You see it's all just a field. The trees are very far away, so it doesn't impede the view of the sky. And this spot here is where we're going to have the sky tour. So after that same night, on Saturday night, Jerry is going to guide us through a tour of the night sky. Even before the sun goes down, he's already starting to show us. And you can see, can you see the laser light right here? So for this, it's also good to get there before it gets dark. Take your favorite lounger, a blanket, pillow, your binoculars, and you can just follow along. Jerry will just talk you right through it and point you from place to place, star hopping. On Sunday afternoon, we have 2 awesome speakers planned for the Star Party. And this all happens at the Interpretive Center, which is, you can walk there, but you'd have to, you'd need probably about a good 20 minutes maybe. You can bike there, and by car you can get there in a couple of minutes. So Gord Chelik is going to tell us about a guide to open source astronomy hardware and software. There's so much stuff out there that we don't know about, and it's free. And he's going to give us some hints about this stuff. We also have Dr. Samar Safi Harb, and she's going to talk about where all the heavy elements really came from. And it's not what we were actually thinking about. You'll be surprised to hear. Sunday evening is when we have the banquet, which is a full course meal at the Raystone Center in the town of Glenborough. And that's a 5-minute drive from the Star Party, and usually we get everybody together and we go in a caravan so nobody gets lost. But you'll also get a map in your kit, so you'll be able to find it no matter what, where you are. It's really easy, and it's such a small town too. Oh, this is another one of Brian's pictures. A lot of these are Brian's actually, and the ones that are crooked or blurry, those are probably mine, but the rest are Ron Berard's, Brian's, I should have mentioned that, Brian's Thatch, and Sheila Switchard. So bring your telescope to the clinic if we might have cloudy skies or rain. But that doesn't matter because it's still going to go on. The Star Party still goes on. It just takes a different dynamic. We can get together at the hospitality tent. Jerry's going to do a telescope clinic. So if you have a solar scope that's not performing very well, or your telescope is not is acting up, bring your sick telescope to Jerry. He'll try to fix it for you. We also have a cabin available to us, like right near the observing field, so we can actually do presentations. We have a setup so that we can do PowerPoints, we can talk, we can eat there, there's a stove. And there's power so that you can charge everything. There's a fire pit, so it's only legal to have a fire when it clouds over. So if you don't want to go to the cabin or you don't want to do whatever else is going on, you can always go and have a fire with the group there. There's always somebody that wants to have a fire. But if the sky's clear, which usually happens as soon as you light a fire, well, the sky's clear. And what do we have to do? Let the fire burn until it dies off, and do not feed it anymore because it's light pollution, right? We went all the way over there to be under dark skies. The fire has to go out. And as soon as that happens, it might cloud over again, but you never know. It's a back and forth thing. So, and that takes me to Star Party etiquette. So it's very important that we don't use white lights. They are actually not allowed in the Star Party field unless you're having an emergency. And we can help you with that. At the hospitality tent, we have red covers to cover up your flashlights. One of the biggest offenders is actually your car. You know, you go open your car and the light goes on and everybody's like, ah! Because not only does it affect your eyesight, which, as I mentioned earlier, it can take 15 to 30 minutes to recover. There are people who take astrophotography and they spend a lot of time and effort doing that, and just a little bit of light like that can just ruin a photograph. If a white light does go on in the field, in a puff of smoke and out of nowhere, Brian Stach, the president of this club, will appear. He's also known as the Astro Diablo. And he'll talk to you all as well, so just need to warn everybody. And then Monday morning, it's all over. But we are having breakfast. We're ordering muffins and cinnamon buns and juice. You can bring your own coffee. And then we take a picture at the end with everybody that made it to the breakfast party. And I think that's it. So if you have any questions or you want to register for the Star Party, come and talk to me during the break. Is there any questions about anything now? We can talk about it now or later.
Who supplies the beer?
Who asked that?
The first person who asked that question.
Yes. Okay, thanks everybody, and maybe we'll see you at the break.
Excellent. Okay, we'll start off with Jay's What's Up? Quiet month this month. what's happening in May and June, because there's hardly any darkness in May and June, but we'll see what we can do to find something that looks interesting.
Yeah.
Go away. Well, there's 2 sunspots on the sun, which is nice if we get some clear skies tomorrow for Science Rendezvous, because last years there's been a completely blank sun, which isn't very interesting. So one of these sunspots is this one here is starting to fade away, but the other one is brand new and looking pretty good. Here we're looking at it in, I believe, ultraviolet light, so there's a lot of activity around it. But when you look at this movie of the solar activity over the last 3-4 days, you can see there's hardly anything happening. A little spit of stuff coming out on one of them and a little stronger one there, but both of those are firing off to the side. They're not coming toward us. So the aurora has been pretty hard to come by in the last few days. And pretty quiet tonight too, according to the reports from spaceweather.com. But there's certainly been a few pictures going around on the discussion board of some of the prominences on the side of the sun, which are always there. So we'll probably have a look at those tomorrow if you want to come by at the university here over by the engineering building, and bring your kids, because it's certainly a family day. And if you want to help out, well, they'll give you pizza too. So this is map is from Carte du Ciel, which I've got a little more fondness for than I've had in the past. It's developed into a rather nice little program. So if you want a star planetarium program, go get this one. It's free, and you take that out to Spruce Woods, and you'll be able to identify what those patterns are up in the sky. So this is tonight at 11 p.m. And you can see we have the moon sitting right in Cancer, the constellation. We have Mars up here sinking pretty low down in the southwest. The Milky Way is just sitting on the horizon here, the summer Milky Way, and the winter Milky Way is just disappearing on the other horizon. So what we're left with is a great big hole in the sky where the only thing that we can really go look at is these little white dots in here, which are the galaxies in Virgo. There's a couple of clusters of them. You've got this group here, which is associated with constellation Virgo, which is in this region, and sort of in the bowl of Virgo, this collection of stars here. And you can point a telescope in there, and just about any place and find some. And then there's another string over here associated with Leo, which is the backwards question mark. It's pretty easy to spot because Regulus here is a pretty bright star, and so is Spica down in here. And it's easy to find Spica because we have the Big Dipper here with its arm, and you just carry that arc down and you'll get to Arcturus. And then if you keep on going, you'll come down to Spica, and that'll help you get in the right neighborhood for finding all of these galaxies. In fact, we have this little thing that we use to help us remind how to find those bits and pieces of the constellation. So these are both very bright stars, and the Big Dipper, of course, we all can find that in the sky. And if you take a look at a map of it, you can begin to identify all of these. Here's the tail end of Leo here. Here's this bowl of Virgo, and some of the more prominent galaxies. If you've got a really good telescope, probably something of the order of 2 or 3 meters across, then you could probably which shows, just point a telescope anywhere in these, and certainly all of the brighter ones would be visible to you, even in a small lunar telescope like the 8-inch that we have, the 8-inch telescope we have to give off to you. So this is a different program here. This one is also free. And this one shows the sky also at the same time tonight, just to give you a little bit of a comparison. Mars and this one is behind the tree that they put in here. But once again, you have the Big Dipper here arcing down to Arcturus and feeding on the Spica. And I put this up because I'm going to use it for the other one. Here we are a month from now, and you can see in this, if you can follow the curve of the Big Dipper, Arcturus and Spica, that they moved along in the sky. They're now over to the southwest, and the Milky Way that was on the horizon is now rising about midnight. And of course, these are where all of the really nice goodies are that we like to look at in the Milky Way. All of this stuff all along it that's worth looking at if you know how to find them in the sky. Well, this is a month from now, but you get almost the same kind of sky if you go tomorrow morning, because this is what the sky looks like at 4 a.m. And again, the Milky Way has moved up it in the south. And I was out 2 nights ago and took some pictures in here, but I left it a little late. Took a 10-minute exposure, looked at it, and it was pure white. And I wondered why, so I went and looked outside, and darned if it wasn't daylight. You can't leave it too long. The trouble is having an observatory where there's a little room in it that it can stay warm in the winter. I can't see the sky. Kind of a wasted 15-minute exposure. Here's what's happening with the planets. Not much happening. Mercury is low in the morning sky, but it's too close to the sun to see. And much the same can be said about Venus too. Although Venus is so bright, if you look carefully, probably with binoculars, you'll be able to see something at least through this month. Mars, I pointed it out to you already, it's sinking into the twilight. You won't be able to find that at all for very much longer. But Jupiter and Saturn are really nice. They get up right now around the midnight hour or a little after midnight, and by a month from now they'll be well up in midnight. And so they're the favorable targets. They're coming into better viewing right now. Uranus and Neptune are both up in the morning, but they're pretty low in the sky, so things are not going to work very well for seeing them. Although if you did find them, you would be able to get a bit of a view. Tonight, we got a chance afterwards that Moon is actually passing through the Beehive cluster, and there's probably an opportunity for some decent photography there tonight, although it's always hard to photograph something right up against the big moon. And so that's good for a few more hours yet. This one is from 11 o'clock tonight. One of the other interesting things is in the morning hours when the Milky Way is coming up, you can basically get a picture of a horizontal Milky Way. So this horizon is curved, so if you straighten it out, the Milky Way would actually be a bit of an arc. It's a very pretty picture that can be taken with any kind of a wide-angle lens on a camera and a 30-second exposure. Just pump your ISO up as high as you can, and you'll be able to see this. It's kind of a very pretty way to look at the Milky Way. What I'm showing here is something else that's kind of interesting because it combines the Jupiter and Saturn together with the Milky Way. So you say through May, and I couldn't put the date, but this is June 10, you see how the two planets converge on each other. But through the whole month, you'll be able to take a rather nice picture if you're willing to get up in the morning in the last of the darkness and take these pictures. The two planets will be straddling the Milky Way, especially as we get into June. Nights are very short in here, so you'll have to challenge yourself. But this would be a picture sometime around 1 o'clock in the morning when it is pretty dark. I expect we'll see quite a few nice little pictures of the two planets with the Milky Way. And of course, it's a short exposure, again, another 30-second exposure with a bit of a normal lens. Well, the big thing around here, when you haven't got very much in the way of sky or darkness, is what's the sky look like. And you can see that they're forecasting rain tomorrow, and some tonight and some tomorrow during Science Rendezvous. Temperatures going up and down. Nobody getting really warm, but there's some 15s in there. These are models, and this is the American model. You look at the Canadian model, the temperatures don't go up and down so much, and it doesn't rain tonight, it rains tomorrow. And what I was doing when Brian interrupted me was looking at short-range forecasts, and they show no rain tonight, which is probably what's going to happen, and only a little bit
course, this one's forecasting quite a bit of rain next weekend. If it's true to form, it won't happen. And I found this for Gail. There actually is a constellation named after a cat. Or was one. Felis. However, it's no longer accepted, but it does have one star that's named Felis. So there you go, Gail. The cat's been immortalized in the heavens. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Jay. Next one, Michelle.
Is that good? Yeah. Okay, so I think this one's going to be fairly short, but this is a picture or artist's conception of two neutron stars colliding. And let's see, yeah. So just the past month, LIGO and Virgo, which had an upgrade to increase their sensitivity, they started observing April 1st, and on April 25th, they found two neutron stars colliding, roughly 50 million light years away. And the 26th, they discovered what they think is a black hole that was eating a neutron star. So that's a first. So they've discovered neutron stars colliding, black hole colliding, now a neutron star and a black hole. So they're getting the trifecta. I always just put these up here because some people don't always, remember what a light year is. So speed of light, 300,000 kilometers a second. And so that's, I don't know, billion kilometers, 9 billion kilometers. And this is just a simulation I found online showing two merging black holes. And what you're seeing is the light distorted here and all the stars around it. And you can see them clash together. So also just quickly, so you can see there's a network here, LIGO, two LIGO telescopes, and one Virgo somewhere in there. Can't quite find it. And then new ones actually they're adding to the network. So this is just an idea of how it works. So here you have a beam. It gets split, and they're adjusted such that they actually cancel out. When a gravitational wave comes through, it stretches one, shrinks the other, and then expands the opposite way. This is just showing you how the waves interfere. So they have destructive interference. They adjust the lengths of these such that light here is dim, they cancel out. And then when a gravitational wave comes through, this stretches, then shrinks, and then this stretches and shrinks, and that's how they detect gravitational wave, because it's distorting the space and time. So that's, and this is about 2.5 miles long, because it's such a very tiny change. Okay, so an interesting thing that they discovered is that there was, during the early solar system, they can explain the actinide abundance due to the merger of two neutron stars. There's been a lot of study on how heavy elements are produced. They're not produced normally by stars. A great episode I've mentioned before is How the Universe Works, and the one episode is How the Universe Built Your Car, which discusses, basically they take a car apart and say where all the parts were developed in this type of evolution. So somewhere 80 million years earlier, before the formation of our solar system, 6 billion years ago, 4.6 billion years ago, these neutron stars collided, created a black hole, accretion disk, and then there were these mega winds that came off and blew this material, this actinides, some gold and platinum, into this pre-solar nebula which formed our solar system, and then eventually give rise to these much heavier elements that we see today. So they predict Pluto's atmosphere to collapse in 2030. Pluto's orbit is 248 years. Surface temperature is around minus 240 Celsius. It's mainly nitrogen, traces of methane, and basically with some modeling done by the University of Tasmania, and they were studying occultations to get some measure of the atmosphere and have models that predict the seasons. And then they compared that with New Horizons flyby, and basically they figure by 2030, basically it's going into winter, and so the liquid nitrogen will freeze to the surface of the planet, making it less red and actually more a bit brighter. And finally, let's see if I can pronounce this name, Hayabusa 1 landed, basically got a sample from the Ictukawa asteroid. And so it was launched 2003, 2005, it gathered the sample. This is sort of a shotgun thing, it just sort of bounced off the surface and penetrated and got information, returned the sample. And some of those small fine grains, these two little grains here, which are less than half the width of a human ear, were loaned to Arizona State University. And they found quite a bit of water in those samples. And some isotopic analysis showed that it's the same as the water in our oceans. And so now they believe that a lot of the asteroids in what was called a late heavy bombardment about 4 billion years ago was responsible for the formation of the oceans and the water on the planet. And here, this asteroid is basically orbiting about 1.3 astronomical units, and it sort of skims inside the orbit of Earth and outside the orbit of Mars. And 1 AU is 1 Earth orbit, which is 1 light year is 63,000 astronomical units, and then that's in kilometers. So, yeah, I don't know if there's any questions.
All right, thank you, Michelle. Everyone's attention, please. Okay, we're going to start in the latter half of our meeting. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much. So, I'm thrilled to be here today. Thanks so much for inviting me. My name is, as introduced, my name is Phil Ferguson. I'm a professor of mechanical engineering at the University of Manitoba here. My position here is in satellite engineering. I hold an industrial research chair in satellite systems, satellite engineering. I was just chatting with a few people here. There may be some former or current Magellan employees. I used to work at Magellan, and Magellan Aerospace is my primary sponsor for a lot of the research that I do. But the reason why I'm here today is to talk about something that I'm very passionate about, and I think many of you probably also are passionate about, and that's our history as Canada in space. And I think that so often we behave so much like Canadians. We're so modest, right? We don't want to stand up in the spotlight. We don't want to take credit for what we do. But I think from time to time it's important for us to take a step back and say, you know what? We have made an impact, a very positive impact, in the global race to space, right? Much of what we have seen in space has been enabled by Canadian work, Canadian engineers, Canadian scientists, and I think it's time that we take a few moments today and acknowledge some of what we've done, some of which you are probably very familiar with, others you may not be familiar with. So we're going to go on a little bit of a journey tonight. But I want to start by acknowledging a great of Manitoba Aerospace that we recently just lost last year. This is, and I'm not Icelandic, by the way, so I may hack this a little bit. Gudmundur Peterson, I think I said that okay. So Gudmundur was born in Manitoba. He ended up joining and serving the Canadian military. He actually fought on the shores of Normandy on D-Day. He came back to Manitoba. He went to the University of Manitoba right here. He got a degree in mechanical engineering. He then went to work for Avro Airplane Company. He worked on the Iroquois engines. for the Afro Aero. He then came back to Manitoba and worked for Pratt & Whitney, where he eventually retired. One of the things I thought was interesting, I teach aerodynamics is one of the courses that I teach at the University of Manitoba, and I always start the first lecture of every course with this to talk about the great work that he did. One of the things I thought was funny was in his later years, he was once asked, what are the 2 most important things that you ever did in your life? And he said, number 1 was he married his wife, and number 2 was he got a degree from the University of Manitoba. That's not too bad. So there's a photograph of him and his mother at his University of Manitoba graduation. So to Gudmundur, we'll dedicate this to him. Now, when I think about our history in space, to me it's so Canadian. It just reeks Canada, right? I mean, it's so much of what we have done. It's like as Canadian as the prairies, as Canadian as pond hockey, right? And so many of the achievements, I feel like, just fit into these stereotypically Canadian things. And so this will be a theme that we come back to several times. And so one of the things that, perhaps one of the first things that Canada did in space started right here in Winnipeg. And I think it's particularly Canadian because it's a giant rocket, right? And when I think about rockets, I think about trying to get as far away as possible from a planet. And in the wintertime, we often try to get as far away from Winnipeg as we possibly can. And that's kind of what a Black Brant rocket does, right? These Black Brant sounding rockets, this is the first one that was ever made. This was actually done by a company, Carty, which eventually got rolled into as part of Bristol Aerospace, which, as many of you know, is now Magellan Aerospace, still here in Manitoba. Still making the Black Brant sounding rocket to this very day. The Black Brant sounding rocket, if you would like to see one up close, there's one in the Manitoba Museum. This was one that I participated in when I used to work at Magellan Aerospace too. I spent about 15, 20 years or so in industry before I became a professor, and part of my time was at Magellan Aerospace. And so when we installed this rocket, I got to learn a little bit about the history of the Black Brant sounding rocket, some of the science that it has done, the ways in which it's changed how we viewed what's possible in sounding rockets. But I would be remiss if I was to stand here today and talk about the history of Canada in space and not show you what it would be like if you were to ride on a Black Brant sounding rocket. Now let me start by saying that these were never, ever meant for people. And you'll see why in a second. I once showed this video to a group of dignitaries at the Canadian Embassy in Washington, D.C. as we were celebrating 50 years in space, talking about some of Canada's historic moments. And sitting in the front row, right about here from me, was Steve McLean, a Canadian astronaut, and at the time the president of the Canadian Space Agency. And he sat back and he said, "Whoa, I'm glad I didn't ride on that rocket." So this is going to go really fast, so I have to kind of narrate a little bit at the beginning before I press play, and I know there's lots of suspense here. But basically what we're going to see is on the left-hand pane, that's looking down, right? So camera on the rocket looking down. On the right-hand pane, camera on the rocket looking up, okay? We've got some little dials there that'll be showing the mission elapsed time, and it will show how fast the rocket's going. In about 2 seconds from liftoff, this rocket is going supersonic. It's spin stabilized, so it will be spinning quite quickly. It's going to release some masses. From this point on, I think I can narrate the rest. So let's go. Now there's sound here too, and part of the sound I find is hilarious. So we'll pop listen to the sound here too. Oh, but the sound's not working. Wait a minute, what's happening here?
That was fast.
It was. hang on. Let's check. It was working a second ago. Let me just make sure. Okay, so here we go. So now I've skipped forward a little bit into flight. Now, we slow down the spin. Now, I find this fascinating. We release a bunch of masses, right? Big, huge masses unroll on the ends of cables. The twang you just heard was cutting those cables. Now we've stopped spinning, deploy some antennas. In a second, we're going to see some of the fairing kind of whiz by on the right there. It hasn't already. There it goes. There's some fairing there released into space. So now science is happening. You can see so far we're at about 145 kilometers. This would get up to about 300 kilometers. Kind of a low altitude one. These can get up as high as about 1,200, 1,500. But to me, this is the best part. So now we're landing, right? So it's coming down. You can see the desert there. And in a minute, you'll see the shadow of the rocket as it approaches the desert. And just have a listen, because this is the best part. Sounds like an unceremonious what was an otherwise really fantastic rocket. Anyway, they still, to this day, are launching Black Grant rockets. There's Black Grant 5, 6, 7, 10, 11, 12. You know, there are many, many Black Grant sounding rockets. If you're up with your Manitoba history as well, they launched them for a period of time out of Churchill, Manitoba. In fact, that rocket range is still there today, although it's mothballed. Many of them are launched out of Virginia, the Wallops flight facility there. Now, I mentioned that there are many different things that people have used to measure with the Black Grant sounding rockets. Perhaps one of the most famous has been the Aurora Borealis. Quite literally, this is very low tech. They waited for days where there happened to be lots of aurora, and they had a rocket on standby, and they would fire it into the aurora and take measurements in the aurora to learn a little bit more about that. What you might not have known about, and I recently learned about this, is a phenomenon known as a noctilucent cloud. And these are fascinating because when these noctilucent clouds happen, the police get lots of strange phone calls. And so basically what they are is when something is up in high altitude, like a rocket or a jet or something, and it's close to sunset, the plume is illuminated, but the people on the ground and the land underneath is not. And so they look quite supernatural, they look kind of extraterrestrial, like E.T. landing on the ground. And so at one point they actually used a Black Grant sounding rocket to purposefully create a noctilucent cloud so that scientists could study it. But they didn't tell the people on the ground that they were going to do it. And so the people all along the eastern seaboard were making frantic phone calls into the FBI and police and saying, there's UFO, it's landing near my house, you need to do something about it. And so an astronomer who was enjoying the night sky, as I'm sure many of you have, saw this happen and madly grabbed a pad of paper and started sketching what he saw and called the newspapers and said, I saw a UFO. Really, it was a Black Grant sounding rocket, purposely creating a noctilucent cloud, which I thought was fascinating, quite fascinating. Now, so that was the Black Grant sounding rocket. So when people ask me, how did the space program begin? I said, well, it started right here in Winnipeg. We made Black Grant sounding rockets. We launched them into space. They weren't orbital. These are suborbital rockets, of course. But it really sort of set the stage. Now, to set the stage further, I need to go back and talk about a little bit about how the space program, our space history as a humankind started. And of course, this all started with Sputnik, really, Sputnik being the first orbital piece of equipment. Now, Sputnik was important, but I mean, let's call a spade a spade. The Sputnik was a ball that beeped, right? And it didn't really have any attitude control to speak of. It was a beeper and a ball, right? And it kind of tumbled around, and it's obviously not there anymore. It was a very low Earth orbit, so it eventually re-entered. So now, interestingly though, that happened on October 4th, 1957. Does anybody want to venture a guess to say what else happened? Something very important in Canada happened on that same day. And I didn't know this until a little while ago. Any idea what happened in Canada on that day? I'll give you a hint. It has to do with aerospace. That's right, Avro Aero, that's right. On that very same day, the Avro Aero was rolled out for the public to see for the first time ever. One of the best ever fighter aircraft. Sadly, as we all know how that ended, that was canceled. But anyway, so interesting little alignment. Remember that, by the way, because the Avro Aero shows up quite prominently later in my talk here. But of course, now, the United States, not to be outdone by the beeping ball that the Russians put in space, said, oh, we can launch spacecraft too, and so they made one. And so on the left here, we see some very prominent engineers. Of course, in the center there is James Van Allen of the Van Allen radiation belt fame, and on the right, Wernher von Braun, who thought to be the father of rocketry, holding up a pretty sure it's a model. It might be the it's definitely a full size. That's as big as Explorer 1 was. Now, there's a fascinating story about this. Now, some of the research that I do into satellites and space systems is in guidance, navigation, and control. And so we talk a lot in class and in our research about what it means to be spin stabilized. You know, we saw the rocket spinning and it's spin stabilized with gyro stiffness. And so there's a really interesting story about Explorer 1 that I think impacts Canada in a very interesting way. And it goes like this. So the US astronauts wanted to make sure their satellite was stable, and so they knew that they had to spin it. And if you do the math and you use Euler's equation, and you can demonstrate that a stable spin is what we call a minor axis spin. So spinning something about its long axis. We call that a minor axis spin because the moment of inertia is the smallest about the axis that you're spinning about. So a long pencil, and you're spinning about the long axis that way. And the math shows you that for a rigid body, both a minor axis spin and a major axis spin, which would have it tumble end over end, should be stable. And so they launched this thing into space, and they started to spin, and everything looked great, and the United States was celebrating, saying, ah, Russia, we too have satellites in orbit. But as time went on, after each orbit, people started to notice something really funny. That spin started to nutate. It was no longer spinning perfectly about its center axis. It started to get kind of wobbly, right? And as the orbits went on, it got more and more and more wobbly, and the engineers were left scratching their heads, so why is this happening? Euler said that this should be a stable spin. And so it turns out, actually, and we learned this because of the Explorer 1 mission, that if you do a little bit more complicated analysis, what we refer to as Lyapunov analysis, you demonstrate that that was only a stable spin if there's no other energy dissipation. And what did we see on this spacecraft but these giant wind antennas that were flip-flopping around all over the place so that they could talk to the Earth? Every time it spun, those were whipping back and forth, dissipating energy, and caused what was a nice minor axis spin to turn into a major axis spin, and eventually the United States lost contact with their spacecraft because it was tumbling end over end. Now, so that was interesting. The US obviously figured out what was wrong, and their later satellites knew what was going on. But I like to think about this guy, right? Do you remember who this is? It's Mikey, right? Mikey likes it, right? Tries the life cereal, right? And what was the thing about Mikey's brothers? They always like to stand back and see if Mikey liked it. Let's see, if Mikey likes it, then maybe we'll do it. Ah, if Mikey doesn't like it, we won't eat the cereal, right? We'll eat shrimpies or something. We'll eat something else, right? And so I kind of think, we Canadians, we're kind of like that, right? We're like, you know what? Let's let the US try it. We'll see how they do. And it didn't work out so well. So when we made our first satellite, we made it short and fat. Short and fat. So now when we spun about our center axis, there was a major axis spin. This was a minimum energy spin. We did the Lyapunov analysis, and our satellite, it worked. Right? Our first satellite, Alouette 1, in September 1962, it worked. And there's something else really interesting. Well, it's sort of interesting. Of those first three satellites, Sputnik, Explorer 1, and Alouette 1. Alouette 1 is the only one still in space. Now, we only have Newton to thank for that, because it happened to be a very high altitude, right? But Alouette 1 is still up there. You can still track Alouette 1. It's not on anymore, but it's still there. Now, that was our first satellite. As many of us know, the 1960s was a very exciting time, very fast-paced time in space history. People learned how to go to the moon. And many people are not that aware, but Canadians had a very, very important role to play in that first ever moon landing, and that was legs. So the first thing to touch the surface of the moon, Canadians. Quebec, right? So those absolutely critical. You can imagine what would happen if the legs didn't work, right? Yeah, so we stuck our feet in the sand there and made sure that our brave astronauts from the United States were able to go for a nice walk. But wait, there's more. So this gentleman, Owen Maynard. Owen Maynard is a Canadian born in, I think, Mississauga, Ontario. Worked also for the Avro Arrow, right? So this was a common theme. When Diefenbaker canceled that program, many of those engineers ended up, some people say defected, but they moved to the United States to work on the Apollo program. Owen Maynard became the chief engineer of the Lunar Excursion Module. So that module that landed on the moon with Canadian-built legs was designed by a Canadian. So there you go. So not only did we have legs on the moon, but the whole thing was designed. The chief engineer was one of from Canada. Now, as Canadians, we also have done a lot with satellites, right? And so one of the first satellites I say one of the first operational satellites, where we actually had commercial operations on it, was the first of the ANIC communication satellites, right? So this was around 1972. A few things that are interesting about the ANIC satellite that I mentioned up there. It provided, for the first time ever, CBC was broadcast for communities in the north. And that was thanks to the ANIC A1 spacecraft. And it was the first ever domestic communications satellite deployed in geostationary orbit. Canadian satellite. What you may not know is that the name ANIC means little brother in Inuktitut. And that was as a result of a Canadian naming competition back in the 70s. And it was won by Julie Francis Zappel from St. Leonard, Quebec. Now, the next picture I show, I have to have a little bit of introduction to this next picture. Me being, I spent a lot of time working on RadarSat constellation mission satellites at Magellan and other small satellites. And of course, we're paranoid about getting spacecraft dirty or electrostatic damage to them, and so we wear all these booties and hats and the buddy suits and the grounding straps. So when I see a picture like this, it makes me lose my mind. That this is ANIC 81, that's the real satellite. And they're getting ready to launch it. I don't know, that guy's poking at something, she's looking at what to do. They're not wearing anything even resembling clean room outfits. Nobody's grounded. Their hair is nice, you know. Nice attire, right? I mean, they look stylish, I guess, all the time. But it drives me nuts that this was acceptable, I guess back then. Now, come the 80s, I mean, we of course Canada was very active through the 70s, launching many different satellites. When it came to the 80s, early 80s, we had an astronaut corps. These were the first 6 astronauts, many of whom went on to have very successful careers. As we all know, at the top, the back row, second in from the left, is Marc Arnault, who was our first Canadian astronaut, and is now the Minister of Transportation. Interestingly, I heard a story once, and I'm not entirely certain that this is true, but Marc Arnault got very, very sick on the Vomit Comet. The Vomit Comet is the parabolic aircraft that they used to train astronauts in. And from what I gather, he got so sick that there were some concerns that he might not do so well in space. But interestingly, and it was a bit of an aside, I did my PhD research in a lab that studied a lot of human factors about how people behave in space and how their bodies react to being in space. Oftentimes, people that are not very happy or doesn't have a very happy stomach on parabolic flight tend to be totally fine in orbit, and vice versa. Sometimes people that are completely fine on the Vomit Comet, on parabolic flight, have a terrible time in orbit. And he was one of the cases where, luckily, he was okay in orbit, and he flew a couple of times. Steve McLean, to his left, our right, he also was a former president of the Canadian Space Agency, and now does a lot of consulting work there. And of course, down in the bottom front right is Roberto Bondar, the first ever Canadian astronaut and a very accomplished neuroscientist, and still to this day. Now, one of the things that I think another common sentiment, we talk about rockets wanting to get as far away as possible from the planet when it's very cold outside. Sometimes we can't get that far away, and so when we do, we just try to stay inside, right? I mean, it's too cold, I don't want to go outside, so I will do my best to prevent waves from us to go outside. I think here at the University of Manitoba, as many of you know, there's a network of tunnels. We try to just avoid the cold at all, in all ways we can. And so we created a giant arm, right? So we made this massive robot arm so that astronauts can stay inside where it's nice and toasty warm in the space shuttle, and we can reach out and grab satellites and do lots of wonderful things with those. Now, one of the things that I thought is interesting is the ridiculous number of uses that this Canadarm went through in the course of the space shuttle program. So originally it was used to deploy satellites. They would grab satellites out of the cargo bay and hold them up and then let them go and then turn on their small engines to move them away from the spacecraft. Astronauts stood on the end of the arm to do some work. They used cameras on the end of the arm to look at various different things. Although I think probably the most interesting RASC, I guess you could say, that the Canadarm ever did was they once fabricated a massive fly swatter to put on the end of the Canadarm, built at this large boom. They basically, the astronauts taped together whatever they could find laying around to make a big boom and a big fly swatter, a big huge piece of plastic with little hooks on it. And the idea was they had launched a spacecraft out of the cargo bay of the space shuttle, but it didn't turn on. And the engineers were wondering, what happened? It didn't turn on. There was a switch. There was an on-off switch on the side of the satellite that they worried maybe didn't get tripped when it was leaving its little cargo holder. So they built this giant fly swatter and they held it up while the satellite was spinning to try to flip that switch. Now, sadly, it didn't work. That wasn't the problem. There was something else wrong with the spacecraft. So they had to grab the spacecraft and put it back in the cargo bay, and they took it back home and figured it was wrong and eventually launched it. But that was interesting. They also used the Canadarm sometimes to knock icicles off the bottom of the space shuttle when they would put wastewater would get spit out into space, and sometimes these little icicles would form, and they would oftentimes use the Canadarm to knock that ice off. But one of the things, and perhaps the most famous, has been to use the Canadarm to service the Hubble Space Telescope. And there are a number of astronauts that are in a very elite club known as Hubble Huggers. That's what these astronauts are. People that have stood on the end of the Canadarm, reached their arms out, and grabbed this massive, I don't have to tell you all this, how important Hubble Space Telescope has been. And the very first ever Hubble Hugger was an astronaut named Jeff Hoffman. Jeff Hoffman flew 5 times in space. He's in Astronaut Hall of Fame, and he was on my doctoral committee when I defended my thesis. And so I got to know Jeff quite well, and we would talk about his experiences in space. And so when I was asked to do this talk, I said, hey, Jeff, I'm going to be talking about Canada's history in space, and you wrote on the end of the Canadarm. Could you give me a few words about what that was like and how it enabled what you did? He said, sure. And so I'll read you exactly what he said to me in an email. This is word for word from Jeff Hoffman. The Canadarm was absolutely vital in the success of all the Hubble servicing missions. Moving around large pieces of equipment, for example, the WFPC-2 and COSTAR on the first servicing mission, and all of the replacement instruments on subsequent missions, would have been extremely difficult without the arm. Also, when you're standing on the arm with your feet locked in, you can react forces against the arm, which allows you to push with one arm without having to when he says pulse, with the other. This was critical in being able to close the gyro compartment doors, which had become warped with thermal distortion and bent out of shape. And so they needed to use quite a bit of elbow grease to close those gyro doors when they were fixing the Hubble the first time. And this I thought was great, though. He says, a nice anecdote. He said, after his missions, he says, I was EVA Capcom on the second servicing mission. And the other 2 Capcoms were Mark Garneau, who we were talking about before, and Chris Hadfield, another Canadian astronaut. He says, at the end of each Capcom shift, you write up a summary, and all the activities that occurred, you have to summarize all the activities that occurred in the previous shift so that the next Capcom can be up to speed. He said, every time I went on shift, the log was filled with comments about all the great things that Canadians had done with the arms on all previous shifts. He says, that's what happens when you get 2 Canadian Capcoms. So that was from Jeff Hoffman. Canadians also like polka dot door. Right, so as Canadians, I know I did. I grew up watching the polka dot door, the Bokaroo, and so of course the polka dot door, there were lots of dots. And so when we had an opportunity as Canadians to do something in space, say with a vision system, we created polka dot door in space. So NEPTEC is a company from the Ottawa area, and they were tasked in the early days of space station to come up with an automated docking system. Now this was in the days well before LiDAR had become prevalent. And we were trying to find out ways, how could you use standard video or still images to figure out where are you as a docking spacecraft in relation to a docking port. And so many, if you look at pictures of space station modules, you'll still see to this day some of these black and white dots, and they are left over from an early space vision system that enabled some of the first ever automated dockings in space. And that was done by a Canadian company, NEPTEC. Now, as many of you know, and actually you can see there on the left, from the Canadarm on the space shuttle, we built more robots. We built the Canadarm 2, which is a larger version, a larger cousin of the Canadarm that was on the space shuttle, and it's still active to this day on the space station. We also created Dexter, a smaller two-armed robot that can do many of the tasks that astronauts can do outside. Dexter was originally, when I worked on Dexter before I went to graduate school. I worked at Spar Aerospace. And back then it was called the Special Purpose Dexterous Manipulator. Eventually, again, a naming contest in Canada named it Dexter. And actually now today, Dexter is used entirely remotely. So engineers at the Canadian Space Agency can command Dexter to go and pick up batteries and replace them and do all these things that typically would have required astronauts to go outside in the dangerous cold. But one of the things that I think is kind of interesting, this is a little bit of a personal story, is that, and this is maybe a little bit of an aside of how we get technology up into space, and oftentimes it means that we have to impress the right people, right? And so this, as many of you probably know, this is Colonel Chris Hadfield, who flew in space several times, actually installed Canadarm2 on the space station. And back when I worked at SPAR, we were developing control systems for Dexter. And as a little bit of background, so Dexter had really, really high gear ratios because a lot of the masses that Dexter was planning on moving were quite heavy, and so you need to have a high gear ratio in order to do that efficiently. And so, unlike the Canadarm on the space shuttle, it had very low gear ratios. And so what that meant was that when the Canadarm on the space shuttle grabbed hold of something, and if there was a minor misalignment in the robot, all they really had to do was limp the arm, right? So they removed all torques from all the joints of the arm, and then as the end effector grabbed onto the object, the arm would deform itself to align itself, basically. But because the gear ratios were so high on Dexter and on Canadarm2, you couldn't do that. Right? So a new technology that we had to create was called force moment accommodation. And basically what it was, we put a force moment sensor in the wrist of Dexter, and it would sense what those forces are and then automatically command the robot to remove those misalignments as the grippers closed on whatever it was you were doing. But it meant that you had to operate this arm a little differently. And so the Canadian Space Agency and NASA said, whoa, 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 SPAR, you guys think you're so smart, you're going to make this robot. We don't want you to do anything until the astronauts agree that it's a good idea. And so they flew 3 astronauts, one of them was Chris Hadfield, to Toronto for 3 days to try out force moment accommodation on this. This was a model of one of the arms of Dexter, which back then we called SPU. And so astronauts only like talking to one person at a time. They're used to talking to Capcoms, and so when I was working there, I was nominated the Capcom. So I sat down with the astronauts, we put them in front of the hand controllers and said, okay, I want you to try this out, see what you think. And now, most of these astronauts were test pilots, right? And so test pilots are used to rating how controllable an aircraft is. And they use a rating known as a Cooper-Harper rating, which basically says, if you get to 0, this is the test pilot that says, I will never use this aircraft ever, it's going to kill people, and number 10 is, I love it, I'm going to fly it every day, right? And so NASA came up with a modified Cooper-Harper rating that they gave to the astronauts and said, we want you to evaluate how useful this space robot would be. And so I sat down with Chris Hadfield and we showed them how FMA works and gave him the hand controllers and he started moving the arm around. And of course what he didn't know was that he was holding onto a battery box and the battery box ended up sliding against what we refer to as a cold plate, basically the alignment plate that was going to move this box in. And he didn't really know that he had done that and he kept trying to move the box further and further into the plate. And the robot wouldn't go that way because it was limiting the forces. It was taking his hand controller commands and turning them into something that was more appropriate to help birth that box. And it wouldn't go. And he turned to me and said, Phil, the robot's not doing what I tell it to do. You guys did something wrong. And I said, well, Colonel Hadfield, you can't do that. There's a wall in the way. So what it's doing is it's moving in the direction that you can move. He says, no, it's not. This robot is completely terrible. I will never use it. He said, give me that form. And he took that form from me and he circled 0 and said, I will never use this robot in space. And the same thing happened to the other 2 astronauts. They got so frustrated and they put their forms down in front of us. There was me and a group of engineers at SPAR and they stormed out. And they said, we're going to come back tomorrow morning at 7 o'clock in the morning and I want you to tell us how you're going to fix it. What are we going to do? And so we spent all night. We were scratching our heads. How are we going to describe to the astronauts that this is how you have to do this? And so we came back the next morning, we regrouped, and we said, okay, look, I want you to humor me for a minute, right? right? So what we did is we showed them a force moment trace. We said, you can look at these forces, you can do this manually if you'd like to, and you can zero all this. And so we let Chris Hadfield do it, and it took him 45 minutes, and he eventually got the box Earth. And we said, okay, now I just want you to do something for us, just to try, just for fun, right? I backed out the arm, we gave it a purposeful misalignment, and I said, I want you to do it again. This time I'm going to turn on first moment accommodation, and I'm going to tell you, don't touch the rotational hand controller, just touch the translational hand controller. Give it an X insertion command only. And he said, that won't work because I need to align it. And I said, don't align it. Let the alignment guides do their job, and the arm will align itself. He said, I don't believe it. I said, well, try it. So he did, and he gave it an X insertion command, and in 30 seconds the box birthed, and he got the little flag showed up that said box done, and he said, wow. And he said, give me that form back. And he crossed out the 0, and he circled 10, and he said, I love it. And then they went back to Pearson, they got on their T-35 trainer jets, and they flew back to Houston. And I guess you could say the rest is history. But we just about lost that entire program that day because the astronauts, and to me, I mean, it was one of those cases from my personal history, but I guess also for a Canadian space history, to say, you know, the human factors part of this is not something to ignore, right? And we as engineers had designed this fancy feature and neglected to properly train the astronauts. You can tell them what it was trying to do, right? They were so used to doing things their own way. And now when you tell a test pilot that they're not really in control of this aircraft or this robot anymore, and that the computer's trying to do it for them, it didn't go over well. But eventually it did, and so now they're using Dexter every day, and it solved lots of problems. So that's an interesting part of Canada's history there. As Canadians, we are curious, right? We love to ask questions. And in Canada, we have been very prolific, I guess you could say, in space experiments, right? So MVIS is perhaps the most Manitoban of those experiments. This is designed and built by Magellan and Bristol Aerospace. And what it is really is it's a micro, I'm not going to get the, I think it's micro vibrations in space. I think that's what it stands for. But really what it is this small laboratory that, that sounds funny, but it creates a clean microgravity environment. And really, the reason why they needed this was all these people wanted to do microgravity research on the space station, right? They said, great, we're going to be in space, we're going to do gravity, we're going to build all these crystals, we're going to make pharmaceuticals, it's going to be awesome. And then they got up there and decided that, it's not really that awesome, because the astronauts are bumping into walls all the time and shaking the place, and then the thrusters turn on and the robots are moving around, and actually the space station is kind of shimmying and shaking all the time. And so at Magellan, and again here in Winnipeg, designed this experiment that created an isolated microgravity environment for people to do very, very clean experiments. And that actually just wrapped up last couple of months, but it was up there for many, many years. And that astronaut there, that's Bob Thurston, another Canadian astronaut using that. Other Canadian experiments, we've done experiments on bone marrow, studying how bone marrow changes in astronauts over long duration space flights. And then there we see on the far right there, that's Chris Hadfield doing a radiation exposure experiment where he was providing blood samples and watching how his body was changing after accruing different total doses. So another thing, so Canadians, we love photography, right? We take pictures all the time. We take pictures of Niagara Falls, the Aurora Borealis, the Canada flying goose sometimes too. And so of course we take pictures in space, right? And so the RADARSAT satellites, I cannot say enough amazing things about RADARSAT. With RADARSAT 1 launching in 1995, sadly we just lost RADARSAT 1 a few years ago. RADARSAT 2 is still very active to this day, launched in 2007. And then of course now RADARSAT Constellation mission, everybody keep your fingers crossed and toes crossed, anything else you can think to cross. This will be launching on June 11th, all 3 RADARSAT Constellation mission satellites designed and built right here in Winnipeg. We'll be launching on a single one Falcon 9 rocket. So let's all hope that rocket works. Because $1 billion program, $1 billion worth of satellites is on one rocket. They will be launching shortly. The impact that RADARSAT has had on the entire globe cannot be overstated. People are using radar images now in ways that they had never ever thought were possible, right? That RADARSAT has been used to study wetlands, it's been used to study glaciers, it's been used to study ice sheets, it's been used for disaster management. You name it, RADARSAT imagery is being used to help solve that problem. And with RADARSAT Constellation mission, this is now 3 spacecraft instead of 1. They'll be flying in tandem. They can do repeated images of the same spot on the Earth, time after time after time And I think, again, we will see another leap in what is thought to be possible these days from radar imagery from space. And again, entirely 100% Canadian solution. And it has literally changed the way that we think of Earth science because of the impact that the RadarSat satellites have done. And so it's a massive Canadian success story, but also a Winnipeg success story too, right here in Manitoba. Small satellites. So, you know, satellites for a long time were getting very, very big, and there are still some very large satellites the size of a Civic or a school bus or something, but starting in around 2003, we started saying, well, what could you do with smaller satellites? You know, we could launch maybe many spacecraft on a single rocket, so we could do small satellites. So, again, in Canada, Canada's first small satellite was SciSat-1, designed and built here in Winnipeg as well, at Bristol Aerospace. Bristol also built Cassiope. Both spacecraft are now still operating and collecting excellent space science. Microsatellites as well. So there's small satellites, sort of the size of, I don't know, kind of whatever would be about this size, big dog, I guess you could say, maybe horse. And then we started making microsatellites. Microsatellites about the size of a suitcase or so. So on the left there, that's MOST. Many of you probably know Canada's first space telescope, the Canada's Hubble Space Telescope, which sadly came to an end of its mission just a few weeks ago, and we were no longer able to talk with MOST. But MOST launched in 2003, was supposed to only last 1 year. It lasted, 2003 to 2019, right? 16 years. 16 years in space after the design lifetime of only 1 year. It was phenomenal. And I'm actually personal friends with Jamie Matthews, who many of you probably also know, the principal investigator of MOST, and it has changed his life and so many lives of astronomers around the world with what it was able to do in such a small package. It really changed the way that we think about space astronomy. Following on from MOST, we built the NEOSat spacecraft, which is now looking at asteroids in space, and that's operational in space right now, and I'm proud to say that I worked on both of them. And then M3MSat, which is doing ship tracking from space. But now, something else in Canada that I think is kind of interesting is, you know, in Canada we say sorry all the time, right? Oh, sorry, you know. But what I think is really important, and not a lot of people talk about this, we like to joke about how we say sorry all the time, but we don't just say sorry, we say sorry and we make it better. We make it better. And one of the things that, while I'm proud to say I worked on NEOSat, I'm not proud to say that NEOSat had some very challenging days right after it was launched. Some equipment failed right away, we lost a magnetometer, we lost the ability to control torque rods, and people, to any other spacecraft, you would look at that and say, okay, you're down one reaction wheel, you don't have torque rods, how the heck are you ever going to desaturate your momentum wheels? I won't get into too much of the guidance, navigation, and control, but let's just say it was a very, very bad day. We had this massive not massive, it was a small spacecraft above it, relatively massive budget, and people were thinking it was completely dead. But thanks to Canadian aerospace engineers, some of which worked at Magellan Aerospace also, they were able to come up with an ingenious way to desaturate momentum wheels without torque rods or thrusters. And it was phenomenal. And basically what they were doing was the satellite has a telescope. It's made almost exactly the same way as the telescope was made for the MOST microsatellite. It's made of Invar, so that we had very little thermal distortion in the spacecraft. It's sort of one of these like bad news, good news scenarios. The bad news about Invar is, well, the good news is that it doesn't have large thermal distortion. The bad news is that it tends to hold magnetic charges. It's rather ferrous. And you don't like to have ferrous things in space because then your satellite turns into a compass needle and it makes it really hard to sort of point where you need it to point. However, the good news is the satellite was made of Invar, so it made the satellite kind of move around and point like a compass needle, and we were able to use that in combination with the Earth's magnetic field to desaturate momentum wheels and bring NEOSat back to full operational status, even with many, many systems on NEOSat kicking the bucket pretty early on. And so what I'm going to show you right now is a short video of NEOSat tracking a space object. And this image, this small video, it was taken, I think, about a year ago. DRDC, Defense Research and Development Canada, uses NEOSat every day to track space objects and catalog them for NORAD. And this is with an amazingly disabled spacecraft. I mean, this is like this would be like a person playing soccer with no arms and no legs, right? Neosat is able to do, right? And so this is thanks to the ingenious, not me. I designed Neosat to start with. I designed it to work with all of the equipment that we thought we were going to have. And then other engineers came back and said, okay, we have a small fraction of what we thought we were going to have. Let's find ways to make it work. And they did, and they're Canadian. And it's a massive, massive success story. And I think we should all be really proud of what they accomplished. So we had small satellites and then microsatellites, and now we have cube satellites, right? Some people call these nanosatellites, or sometimes even pico satellites. But CubeSats are the next big thing now, right? People are saying, wow, what could you do with a satellite? Oh, about this big, right? And so here at the University of Manitoba, I'm again very, very proud to say that we have been pioneering CubeSats. We weren't the first to make CubeSats by any stretch, but this past year, our students at the University of Manitoba won first prize in the Canadian Satellite Design Challenge, making a small CubeSat. We call it Triple CubeSat. And we are now using that design as part of the Canadian CubeSat program. And we're building a small CubeSat that will watch how asteroids and other space rocks change their optical properties over time, and mixing that data with the OSIRIS-REx sample return mission from asteroid Maine. That's really exciting. Does anybody know who these people are? You recognize them? I wouldn't think so, because they're my parents. and my parents, but there's an interesting thing about my parents, and that is that I'm sure they are the same as everybody else's parents, in that they seem to be completely obsessed with weather in places where they are not. Right? So my mom, they live in Ontario. In fact, actually, my parents are at my house right now. They landed this morning. They were visiting for the weekend. And even today at dinner, my mom was telling me what the weather is like in Niagara Falls. But Mom, you're not there. You're here in Manitoba. Why do you care so much about the weather in places where you are? She calls me all the time, Philip, it's going to be really cold. Do you have a toque, right? And so she's constantly pointing me, look, minus 40, what are you going to do? You're going to make sure the kids have hats. And so what did we do as Canadians when we were given the opportunity to go to Mars? We sent a weather station. We sent a weather station to Mars so that we could tell you if it was snowing on Mars, and it did. We were the first ever, a Canadian instrument detected snow on Mars. How great is that, right? It's like my mother calling me and saying, you know what, it's snowing on Mars, just thought you'd know. And I'm like, great, thanks, But as Canadians, we really care about the weather a lot. And that's what that is there. LiDAR-based weather station on Mars. We were also part of the asteroid sample return mission, right? And so this is the OSIRIS-REx mission as well. We made a laser altimeter to find out how close the spacecraft is to the asteroid when it finally gets close enough to reach down and scoop up some asteroid material. That should be happening soon, I think. Relatively soon. It's in orbit right now around the asteroid, and so that's really exciting. And what will make that mission possible is Canada's laser altimeter. Fascinating. So you might look at all this and say, that's great, look at all the stuff we've done in space, so what's next, right? And so there's so much stuff next, right? So the James Webb Space Telescope, that's going up soon, and we have the Fine Guidance Sensor. The Fine Guidance Sensor is Canadian technology, and that will make the James Webb Space Telescope possible to do its thing. David St. Jacques, he's on ISS right now. He's our Canadian astronaut doing wonderful space science, doing outreach with students, linking up with them, talking about space science, getting kids excited about STEM and STEAM. We're talking about a new space station now at L2, the second Lagrangian point. This lunar gateway. I'm not certain if it's going to happen now. Trump wants to get to the moon fast, so who knows if that'll actually happen. But we are, as Canada, we're very involved with that. Some of the research that I'm doing is looking at ways in which we can dock spacecraft at L2. And then, of course, there's moon and Mars exploration as well. So, I'd like to, just keep a little image of Lego Man up in low Earth orbit. Actually, not orbit. This was on a sounding rocket. But really, the point I wanted to make is we have a tremendous amount to be proud of. We're in Canada here. We're astronomers, we're scientists, we're engineers, and we are making a difference. We are making a massive difference. And I look at the past 60 years of what we've accomplished. I look at the next 60 years ahead of us and the years beyond that. We have a lot to be excited for. And here in Canada, I think we don't take credit for it enough. So, way to go, Canada. Way to go, everyone here, too. And that's what I had to say today. So, thanks very much for your time. So I'm happy to take questions, although I say I didn't live most of that history, a very, very small part of it. But I'm happy to have a discussion in this. Yes.
I read somewhere that the Gemini spacecraft was designed by a former aero engineer. Is that true?
You know, I don't know for certain, but that sounds very plausible, right? Many of the accomplishments in the American space program around that time were made possible because of engineers that got kicked out of the Avro program when it got cut off. So I wasn't aware of that, but if that, I will look that up and I will add it into this talk the next time. So thanks for bringing this. Yes.
There must be a whole lot of space junk orbiting the Earth. Is there any plan or any kind of procedure that they might use a Canadarm or some kind of system or something to start trying to clean it up?
So yeah, so the question was about space junk. There is a tremendous amount of space junk. So I have a couple of interesting things to say about that. Oh, a few things. So number one, Canada has been very active in a group known as the UNCOPUOUS. It's the United Nations, something on the peaceful use of space. But part of that group is looking at more responsible ways to use space. And some of the rules that have been proposed that are starting to come into play now is that if you are launching a spacecraft, you have to have some way to get rid of it within 10 years of it finishing its useful life, right? One of the things that I'm a little sheepish to say, while I'm very proud of the work that I and my colleagues were able to accomplish with MOST, when MOST died 3 weeks ago, that's it. Yeah, I mean, MOST is now will be in that orbit, which is a relatively useful orbit for about 300 to 400 years, right? Because it's really high, right? And so it is not going to decay in anyone's lifetime. And that's a problem, right? And so we kind of look back at that and say, well, that was back in 2003. We know a lot more now. For instance, the spacecraft that I and my students are designing right now is being designed to re-enter within 2 years of it going up there. So I think we're seeing impressive changes, but that doesn't change the fact that, to your point, there's a lot of space junk out there, right? And there are a number of theories out there that say it doesn't take many collisions for that problem to become much, much worse, right? So some Yahoo country decides to do an anti-satellite demonstration and blow up a satellite. Now what was one piece of space junk is now millions, right? And those millions of pieces of space junk create more millions of space junk. And there are theories that once you get to a certain density of space junk, that problem just balloons. So what are we doing about it? A few months ago, there was a really fascinating demonstration put on by SSTL, so Surrey Satellite Company in England, that demonstrated from a CubeSat. They had a number of different techniques to try to capture space junk. One of them was a big net that they threw out and demonstrated that you could capture a little bit of junk. The one that was really funny and kind of hilarious to watch, and you can Google this and see it on YouTube, is they fired a harpoon at a piece of space junk, and they captured it and reeled it in like it was a fish or something, right? And they brought it in and they demonstrated that worked. So the answer to your question is yes. It's a really hard problem because of the relative velocities, right? I mean, two objects in neighboring orbits could be traveling at tremendous relative velocities with respect to one another, right? I mean, a small piece of, a small speck of paint can blast right through an entire satellite and destroy it. Interestingly, though, there is a lot of research even happening right here at the University of Manitoba. So Dr. Igor Telechev in the mechanical department is studying ways in which high velocity impacts change spacecraft structures and finding ways to not only protect against those impacts, but mitigate the debris cloud if that were to happen to try to solve some of that. And in my research lab, I'm kind of taking a little bit of a different look at it. I'm saying, well, you know, life gives you a lemon. Well, let's make lemonade, right? We got all this space junk floating around anyway. Let's use it to our advantage, right? So we're just publishing a paper right now on how we can use star trackers that see streaks of space junk fly by and use that information to help us navigate in space if we've lost GPS. So there are some interesting work that's going on of ways to mitigate the problem, prevent the problem from happening again. Some people are looking at trying to catch them, but I think really prevention is the best way, right? Let's make sure that anything we put in space has a plan to get it down, so we don't have more MOST out there, right? Okay.
What should we be doing that we aren't?
What should we be doing that we aren't? You mean to mitigate that problem?
Not that problem, just Canada in space.
Canada
what would be
in
an
space.
easy thing for us to do that we aren't?
Easy thing for us to do that we aren't. So, I'll say something that some people, it's quite polarizing, but I fall squarely in the camp that we as Canadians need access to space. We need better access to space, both in terms of the technologies we need to get us inexpensive access to space, so we're not spending a decade to design space missions, and we're not spending hundreds of millions of dollars. There's a colleague of mine, his name is Rob Z. He runs the Spaceflight Laboratory at University of Toronto, and I've worked with Rob for many, many years. And he has this concept known as the virtuous and vicious cycles, right? And so the vicious cycle that we always talk about in space is that it costs us so much money to make one spacecraft. It takes us so long to make just one, right? And so because it took us so long to make it, damn well better make sure that thing works, right? So we spend even more money to test and test and test, and we put really expensive resistors in it and really expensive things to make sure that it absolutely will work, right? And so the more we get worried about that one spacecraft not working, the more money we spend, the more budget we spend on that, and we make it so that we can make fewer and fewer and fewer. And we dig ourselves into the ground that way, right? Whereas on the other side, you have the virtuous cycle, right? And the virtuous cycle goes like this. If we can convince ourselves that it's okay to fail, right? It's okay if something goes wrong, right? We're going to make spacecraft really inexpensive. Let's make a spacecraft that only costs us $10,000, right? And because it's so inexpensive, we can afford to push the envelope a little bit. Let's see what happens if we build a spacecraft out of 3D printing, right? Let's use adaptive controllers, machine learning. Let's try these new technologies that all these other industries are using around us. The space industry, we're just terrified. We're terrified because what if it fails? We only get one shot at it, right? The Canadian Space Agency can only afford one satellite every 10 years. We better get it right. You know, so let's find ways to make them inexpensive, push this boundary. Let's not be afraid to fail. And the more we do that, the more money we have, the more we can launch, right? So that's what we need to be doing, number one. And number two, we need a launcher capability here in Canada, right? We need to be digging into this Black Rat sounding rocket technology. Magellan wants to do it, right? Magellan has the capability to do it. We can make orbital rockets, right? And we might see some of that in the near future. There's a company starting up right now out of Halifax. They're Maritime Launch Services, MLS. They'll be launching decommissioned nuclear missiles from Russia. That float over on a boat to Canada and launch those. But it's a start. You know, at least we can start controlling our own destiny in space, not relying on somebody else's rocket. I think that's what we also need to do. Yeah.
Should someone put the James Webb Space Telescope to a place where it can't be fixed? Because the Hubble was fixed.
Yeah, so good question. So you say it's hard to get to L2, right? That's basically your point, right? How are we going to get there to fix it if/when it breaks? You know, I think you all know better than I do the benefit of having that telescope at L2. I don't have to talk to you about that. But so I think in this day and age, I think we've learned a lot since the late 80s on how to make space hardware and how to validate space hardware. I'm personally quite confident in what I'm seeing come out of this James Webb. It may sound strange, but with every problem they find on the ground, I kind of, phew, good thing we found that, right? That would really suck to get that thing up there to L2 and not be able to get up there and fix it. Is it a risk? Absolutely it's a risk. But you know what? To my point before, we have to take risks, right? If we're not taking risks, we're not moving forward, right? And I look back at what we saw in the 60s and what we were able to accomplish with Gemini and Apollo, and even with a lot of the space robots we've done. We've taken risks, and sometimes they work, and sometimes they don't, but we always learn. And so, personally, I think it's the right call to have it at L2. You know, ask me again when it's in orbit and they need to fix something on it, maybe not, but I think it's important to take risks. Yeah?
Speaking of space junk, I read somewhere that someone is thinking of putting billboards in space, low Earth orbit, by launching a bunch of small satellites that reflect the sunlight, arranging it to spell Edith Jules.
Sure.
Do you think it's going to happen? Are they going to allow that? And do they not realize it's just space junk?
Yeah. So, do I think it's going to happen? You know, there's a lot of I think harebrained space ideas out there. Do I think it's going to happen? It might. The one thing I will say is that to the space junk aspect of things, it's not just the UN committee that's cracking down on this. It's also the FCC in the United States and our counterparts, not the FCC, it isn't really the CRTC, but there are Canadian consortiums that watch out for space junk as well. You may have heard of a recent case of a company called Swarm Technologies in the United States that launched a whole bunch, I think it was a dozen or so, spacecraft. They were about the size of a grilled cheese sandwich, right? So they were even smaller than these CubeSats that my students are building right now. And the reason why they were, this company had gone to the FCC and asked permission to launch these spacecraft, and they were denied permission because they were concerned that they were too small to track. And if you can't track them, you don't know where they are, they might smack into the space station or some other spacecraft and make this problem a whole lot worse. Now, they ended up launching anyway and got themselves in a whole whack of trouble and an $800,000 fine. Personally, if you ask me, I think it was a calculated risk they took because they used that to demonstrate that you could actually track them using ground-based telescopes. However, be that as it may, I think that with the oversight that we have now, the risk of something like that causing major problems is probably quite low. Do I think it's a great use of space technology? No, right? But I think as long as it's done safely, I can't really complain too much about it other than I think it's blatant commercialization of space, and I think we can use space for a lot better things than billboards. But I am impressed with what I'm seeing recently with trying to prevent space debris from causing problems. The real problems, I think, are when we see demonstrations. Recently, there was a demonstration done about a month ago of another anti-satellite technology that created a massive debris field. Now, the country that did it claimed that it was low enough orbit that they were all going to re-enter, and that was true for about 80% of the debris, but 20% of it is still up there now, and I know it's being tracked by my colleagues at DRDC. So I think it's those rogue activities that are trying to demonstrate some sort of military prowess. That's what I'm mostly concerned about. I'm not that concerned about billboards other than I would rather look up at a beautiful night sky and not see billboards in the sky, as I'm sure you know.
One more thing too, why did they shut down Churchill? And is it available for reuse?
You know, I've asked that question to a few of my colleagues that spent many, many weeks and months in Churchill. I don't know the answer to why they shut it down. I've asked if it could ever be resurrected, and I got a definite maybe. You know, it has been mothballed. I saw about 3 or 4 years ago, a colleague of mine was up there on other business, which I had to laugh at. What other business is there in Churchill? What else are you doing in Churchill if you're not launching rockets or running away from polar bears, I guess? But they were up there and they went to go visit the rocket compound there and took pictures of the model of the Black Brant that's still out there rusting away. And it's sad to see, but a little bit encouraging to see that those bunkers are still there and the facilities are still there. I think that they could resurrect it. It would be tremendously expensive. But the word from my colleagues at Magellan is that it's possible. But don't hold your breath. That's what I'm told.
Other questions? Okay.
All right. Well, thanks very much. I appreciate it.
The meeting at Boston Pizza on Pembina, yes, I got confirmation that you have reservations for 10 o'clock, so thank you for coming out, and we'll see you then.